Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about is macros. And what macros is almost the same as functions, but they can contain delayed or timed functions. So what I mean by this, let's create something. So for example, in the begin play, let's print a string to the screen, and it's just saying hello. And let's delay this code by 2 seconds or to 0.2 second. And let's print another string saying hello again. This is very creative. Okay, so now we have this code. And now if I try to mark these and right click and collapse to function, just like we learned in the previous lesson, now it will say collapsing to function failed. And why is this? Let's click on the show message log, and it's going to say delay cannot be placed in function graph. So very important to know, functions cannot contain delayed or timed functions. That's what they're called. They cannot contain timed functions. So you can't really collapse it to a function. This will not work. You can collapse this to a function and this to a function, but you can't really collapse this delay inside of a function. So instead of doing a function, you would do a macro instead. So right clicking it and collapse to macro. Now you have a macro, and you can give it a name. For example, I don't know, just message, whatever. So now you have a macro, and you can see here it actually contains a delayed function or a timed function. And this is what you want to do. If you have any timed functions, you can't create functions, you can create macros. If you double click it, just like before with the functions, you can see here you can enter it and you can view the macro. So now you can see we have an input and an output, just like we had with the function. So if I double click the function again so we can view it, we have the input here and the output, which is the return node. And the same thing we have with the macro, but now we can actually have a timed function inside of it. If we go back to the event graph, you can see that we don't really have an execution pin here, just like we have here. So we can't really continue our code. And this is because you have to add one. And inside of the macro that we have, you have this output. And this output, you can add a variable just like you did with the function. And here you can add an execution pin. So this is something you couldn't do with functions. You can't really add execution pins, but you can do it with macros. So you can connect it, compile, and you can see here, now we have an execution pin, and we can just continue our code if we want to code more in our game here in this event. So now you can see here, this is the name of it. So give it something that makes sense. For example, let's just call it return. And you can see here, it changes name. And a cool thing about macros too, apart from the timed functions, is you can create multiple execution pins. If I click these three, let's call it win, let's call it lose, and now you have multiple execution pins which you can use here in your graph. So this is pretty cool, and these have uses too. So if you want multiple events to happen here, you can make a macro and do so. You can't do it with functions. Functions always have one pin only, but macros can have multiple pins, and they can have timed function or timed functions. What I usually do when I program is I never create macros unless I really need multiple execution pins, or if I have, in this case, a delay, a timed function that I need to collapse, and I can't collapse it because you can't collapse delayed function or timed functions to a function, I will collapse it to a macro instead. We also have already pre-made macros, and this is, for example, the is valid. If I write is valid, and let's see how we can find it. If we scroll down, you can see this one. This one is actually a macro too. So maybe you have seen it before, maybe not. This is a macro, and this is actually used, we're going to use it later, but this is used to see if our object is valid or not. So for example, if we create a reference to this floor, we can connect it, And now the game checks, is this floor valid before I continue the code? Because if the floor does not exist, why should I continue the code? So this is actually a macro. And if you double click it, you can see here that it's actually a macro and there's some logic inside of it. Okay, let's go back to our graph. And to see your macros, you can see them here to the left in the macros tab. This is the one we have created. And you can create multiple macros either again by collapsing it to a macro, or you can make a new macro by clicking on the plus and you can give it a name. I'm just going to call it name. And you can put your logic inside of here. And again, you can create variables, for example, execution pins if you need them. You can also create other variables, for example, booleans and so on. All right, so this was it for macros, and I hope this was not too confusing. Let's continue to the next lesson, and very soon we will try to use all what we've learned into an example so we can learn better of how to use the macros, how to use the events, and how to use the functions.